Is everyone ready? Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming after your long day at work. I hope it's worth it this evening for you. My name is Joanna. I'm part of the board of Stockholm AI, and I'm also here with the event management team. We have salads for everyone, so I hope everyone took salads and drinks. Now, if you're not yet a member of Stockholm AI, feel free to join. We have a very cool Slack channel where they post like job positions, cool AI news, where we also share the next events and everything that we have coming up. So feel free to join. Of course, we also share it on LinkedIn. Yeah, I have here my notes. Yeah. So we are on this location today, thanks to these partners. And we're also always looking for partners, for venues, for speakers. So if you like our events and if you are in a company that would have the possibility or interest to be a partner, please contact us. Anyone from us right now today or through email, through LinkedIn, that would be amazing. Especially for our next events that we don't have selected venue yet. Yes, talking about the upcoming events, we have quite a few on the pipeline, so maybe I'll let you know a bit about them. So just like this event, we have a few academic events coming up, where we have PhDs, postdocs, professors within the massive field of AI, sharing a bit of their research, like today. We also have a few industrial events coming up. For example, we're going to have AI and education in February, I think. And we're going to have a hackathon with Stockholm AI and Mimer, I think in March. And we're going to have some computer vision in industry with Codon, I think also in March. So we have a lot of things coming up soon. And you're going to get, the link to register on LinkedIn or Slack. Yes. So for today, we invited 3 very cool researchers from 3 different fields. Let me tell you a bit about them. The first one that's going to present today is Professor Anandi Hattiangadi from the Institute of Future Studies. Then we have postdoc Belén García Pascual from KTH and KI. And we have André Silva doing his PhD at KTH. And let me just add that we don't have a panel today because we chose to have more networking time. I hope that's in line with you, but also let us know what you prefer. Because we believe that academia and industry should perhaps communicate more, have more bridges. So it would be super cool if that happens today. Yeah. So I'm going to start by inviting Professor Anandi Hattiangadi to present her work on AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, a Philosopher's Manifesto, in partnership with Cambridge. So feel free to come to stage. I think we have your slides here. And I'm also going to put this, you can let me hold it. You can put it somewhere close for recording.
Is this good? Can I? Will it work? Okay. Does that work? Yes. Okay. So first of all, thank you very, very much for inviting me to speak here. I think that it's very exciting to do this kind of work bridging the gap between academia and industry. And so what I'm presenting today, in fact, is in some ways an invitation for further collaboration. So what I'm presenting is in part material from a monograph that I'm working on at the moment that is under contract with Cambridge University Press, and it's got the same title as the talk. But this is also an invitation to further collaboration. So this is the book I'm working on. It's funded by the Wallenberg Academy. I have a grant called Cogito Machina. The title, I have to say, Cogito Machina, was suggested to me by ChatGPT, and it means I, a machine, think. So this is really fundamentally about thinking machines. This is what interests me. And the invitation is to work on a grant proposal that I'm putting together with Julian Togelius. He is a fantastic AI researcher at NYU, and we are together planning to put in an application on artificial general intelligence to this new call that I'm sure many of you know about, which is a joint call between Vinnova and the Swedish Research Council, Vetenskapsrådet. So part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is our ideas for this proposal. We're looking for industry partnerships. And the topic, of course, is on artificial general intelligence. So, so right now, there's something like billions and billions of dollars are being poured into the development of AGI. Right? AGI is generally glossed as machines that are at least as intelligent as humans. But it seems to me that there are some really critical flaws in our current conceptions of AGI. And these flaws, it seems to me, are not technological. They're actually philosophical problems. You might think of AI as kind of brand new technology, all these new systems that have been launched recently and are really exciting. But in fact, many of these technologies, or at least the concept of AGI, what we're aiming towards, they're based on very old philosophical views about the mind. So AGI, as I said, is generally indexed to something like human-level intelligence, right? It might be glossed as a machine that's at least as intelligent as a human, or has an intelligence that equals or surpasses human intelligence. And so the problem is that whether or not we want to think of a machine as an AGI or as coming close towards achieving human-level intelligence depends on our conception of what human intelligence is. And the classical accounts of human intelligence, that's what I'm here to tell you today, are fundamentally flawed. So there are two classical paradigms, rationalism and empiricism. And the flaws, I want to say with these, I'm going to present some of the problems with the paradigms, but the problems are really, in fact, very well known. So the problems in philosophy were already sort of discussed. They've been absolutely central to the philosophy of mind and language for, 75 years or something like that. The problems were raised by people like Wittgenstein and Sol Kripke. And I think that they were really set aside in a way by cognitive scientists, by philosophers to some extent. These difficulties with the traditional paradigms were kind of set aside because no one really knew how to solve them, right? So there was no real alternative to the classical paradigms. And though I think, setting aside problems is typically not a great way to solve them, as it happens, it seems to me that over the past, 20, 30 years or something like that, there's a new paradigm that's developing within the cognitive sciences that presents a radically different, in some ways it builds on rationalism and empiricism, but it kind of radically better understanding of the way the human mind works, the way we understand language, and the way we can acquire concepts that departs in certain very significant ways from the traditional paradigms. And so this is the paradigm I'm calling sort of neoclassicism. It's something that I sketch in the book with Cambridge, and I'm going to give you a very brief overview of that view here. And the idea that Julian and I have is to sort of develop this neoclassical paradigm further in philosophy and cognitive science, the sort of theoretical picture of the mind that it presents, build on this recent work that seems to me to be pointing in a new and very exciting direction, and also use it to build better technology, right? Better technology that is more closer to what we know are best accounts of human cognition to be like. Okay, but before I talk about that, I'm going to say something first about the problems. Many of you may already know some of these problems, but I'm going to just rehash them in sort of an updated context. So the first set of problems I'm going to talk about have to do with empiricism. So classical empiricism is the view, broadly speaking. I mean, there's many different versions of it, but it's most closely associated with the early modern thinkers, John Locke and David Hume. So the classical empiricist picture holds that all of our knowledge is derived from sensory experience. So perceptions of sound, visual experiences, gustatory experiences, and so forth. This is where we obtain all of our knowledge, and we obtain that knowledge, according to the empiricist, just by exercising domain general mechanisms like pattern recognition or association. These are the basic fundamental mechanisms by which we learn everything that there is to learn about the world. And specifically, what empiricists exclude, though they allow that there are certain kinds of innate things, we have certain innate representational capacities, we have innate domain general learning mechanisms, but what they exclude specifically is innate abstract concepts or general rules, like a Chomskyan universal grammar or anything like that, right? So we don't have any of this innate apparatus, we just have this kind of domain general learning mechanisms. And the current front runners in the race for AGI, the favorites at the moment, are systems like large language models or agentic systems that are augmented versions of large language models, hybrid models that combine language processing with other forms of computation, like image recognition software. These are the kinds of systems that people talk about as potentially having sparks of AGI, or as being capable of perception, of reasoning, of solving mathematical problems, and so forth. And I think one of the reasons why large language models seem to be so likely to be on the path towards AGI is because they're incredibly fluent at using language, right? They can banter, they can write poetry better than most students. They can ace the LSAT, you know, and language is just one of those things that's so quintessentially human, right? We express ourselves in language, we express our minds in language. It's really hard to interact with a system that's that fluent without thinking of it as having a mind like ours. But so the thing is, large language models, ChatGPT and Gemini and so forth, they are fundamentally they're like computational implementations of classical empiricism. They start their lives out, I'm sure many of you know more about this than I do, but they start their lives out with a domain general learning mechanism that's pre-programmed. They're not pre-programmed with any kind of innate representations of abstract concepts. They don't have necessarily domain-specific learning mechanisms. They can just be trained on any body of data, right? So this is like a classical empiricist picture. And the way in which they learn is by learning to detect patterns in the body of data, right? They are associative engines. They are classic empiricist machines. But the problem is that, as Wittgenstein and Kripke have shown, I think, is that classical empiricism has a fundamental problem with explaining specifically language acquisition and language, what it is to understand a language or to have abstract thoughts. So the fundamental problem arises because linguistic meanings are abstract. This is, I think, the source of the problems that Kripke and Wittgenstein go on about. So consider a sentence like, Margot is a cat. This contains these words, the word Margot, and then this phrase, is a verb phrase, is a cat. And the sense in which these meanings are abstract is that the name Margot denotes, it picks out a particular individual, Margot, in abstraction from any of its properties, right? If you hear the word Margot uttered, you might know that it refers to some individual, but you don't necessarily know even that it's a cat, right? You don't know anything about it just by hearing the name Margot. And the expression is a cat picks out the set of all and only cats, right? But it doesn't tell you anything about which particular individuals are in that extension. So linguistic meanings are abstract in the sense that they abstract all this information away. They sort of laser focus either on an individual or a property or a function or a relation or whatever. So we want to distinguish words and I say icons or iconic representations in perception, perceptual experiences, the sorts of things that empiricists take to be the kind of basis of all of our knowledge. So words are abstract, and they are, because they're abstract, they are generative in a particularly important way. So any name can be combined with any predicate to produce a sentence that has some kind of truth evaluable content, a sentence that can be true or false. So, for example, I can construct the sentence Margot is a dog. If you know the name Margot and you have heard Margot is a cat, you can just mix and match the name with another predicate that you might have in your vocabulary, like is a dog, and construct the sentence Margot is a dog. And you can do the same thing in thought, and this is partly because the name picks out an individual and doesn't tell you anything about its properties, so you can put it together with any predicate whatsoever and deliver a sentence that has a truth condition. It can be true or false. But icons don't work that way, right? Icons, so if you consider the picture, to go back, of the cat, right? Margot, there's this one region of the photograph that represents Margot, the cat, as being black, as having a certain shape, as being furry, and so forth. So it represents a sort of cluster of properties as instantiated by a particular individual. It doesn't abstract the individual from its properties or the properties from the individual. And this is, I'm going to say, crucial. So icons are concrete. They represent concrete particular instantiations of properties, clusters of properties. They're not generative in the same way as linguistic meanings are. They might form the basis of generalization, right? So if you see a bunch of cats, you've had experiences of a bunch of cats, you've represented or associated a set of properties that come in this kind of cluster, then you can, on the basis of that, extend to a new instance when you see something that instantiates even just some of the properties in that cluster. Okay, so you could get this kind of generalization, but it's a case-by-case generalization that's not fully generative. So unlike the sentence, Margot is a dog, that you can construct by virtue of just putting together the name Margot with an arbitrary predicate that's in your lexicon, you can't do that with icons, right? So if you associated, say, the name Margot with this picture of Margot, and you thought, well, like, let's just put it together with another icon, the one that's associated with, say, being a dog, well, you don't really get a sentence just by putting those two things together, and you don't get anything truth valuable. And the reason for that is that these representations have concrete contents, not abstract ones, so they cannot be recombined in the same kind of way. And so what follows from this is that understanding the meaning of a word just cannot be the association between the word and even a set of iconic perceptual representations, right? That just can't be what it is to understand the meaning of the word, because you would not recognize the abstractness of the meaning. And so how does this apply to ChatGPT or LLMs more generally? Well, if they're associative engines, right, what they're doing is just forming associations either between tokens and tokens, or if you have these kinds of multimodal models, you might have them forming associations between words and images. But no matter how much of that association you get, you're never going to get understanding of an abstract meaning. So even a system that's incredibly good at producing images in response to prompts, or vice versa, labeling images, that is not understanding meaning, because it doesn't capture abstraction. And what's particularly important is that it's never going to be generative in the right kind of a way, because you cannot combine those systems in those kinds of representations in the way that you can words with abstract meanings. So one kind of response to this worry that I have might be, well, look at benchmarks. LLMs do really well on benchmarks, right? They can, ace the LSAT. They can perform extremely well on tests, sometimes even better than humans. Tests that are designed for humans, but better than humans. But I think that there's a fundamental problem with the whole benchmarking methodology, particularly when it's used to test for things like understanding and knowledge. And the reason is that benchmarks basically test input-output functions. So a benchmark will be, a sort of a set of inputs, and then you measure the system's outputs against some kind of scoring rule, maybe comparing it with humans in their ability to solve the test. So basically what it tests for, what it tells you about, is what a particular system, what a particular system's kind of, the function it implements, right, the input-output function that it implements. And the problem is that, so the first problem is that these input-output functions of any actual system, this is the kind of Wittgensteinian problem, are never going to be sufficient for understanding fully abstract, open-ended meanings. And so the illustrative example I'm going to give you is from Wittgenstein. It's the example of the wayward child. Okay, so he discusses this case in the Philosophical Investigations, and he imagines that, so Wittgenstein, as it happens, was a teacher, and actually kind of an abusive and horrible teacher, but so you can imagine this kind of taking place, Wittgenstein getting really frustrated with the wayward child. But here it is. So Wittgenstein says he's trying to teach the child to count by twos, to learn the meaning of +2, and the child says, starts off pretty well, goes like, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so forth. And Wittgenstein thinks, yeah, great, you're doing really well. Now you understand. But how about you start at 1,000 now? And then the child goes 1,000, 1,004, 1,008, 1,012. And Wittgenstein says, wait a minute, stop, 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 stop. You're not doing the same thing that you did before. I told you to count by twos. You seem to understand that. And now you're doing something different. And the wayward child says, no, 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 I am going on in the same way. This is how I always understood the expression count by twos. This is what plus 2 means, right? This is the rule that I was always following. This is what I always thought. This was the function that I always thought that it referred to. And so Wittgenstein, what's the upshot of this? Well, the upshot is that the input-output function that the wayward child implements, right, the answers that it gives to these small sums, is just not the function that, as a matter of fact, is denoted by add 2, right? The wayward child misunderstood the meaning of that expression. The wayward child was computing some other function other than plus 2. But since, and Wittgenstein didn't know this when he saw only the first part of the series. But the point is that since many functions that we might denote with the term like number or successor or plus 2, these are open-ended functions, and any system, any finite, any physical system is going to implement, as a matter of fact, some finite function, and any finite function that a system implements will only ever approximate the true function that is meant by an abstract or open-ended expression. And the same goes for ChatGPT. It is also a physical system implemented on a physical server. It has a finite context window. There's only so many tokens that can be input into ChatGPT and only so many tokens it can output. Even if you were to expand that token, there's going to be some upper bound to how big it can be. It's going to be finite at any rate. And so you'll never, like whatever function it actually implements is always going to be a finite function, which will only ever approximate an infinite one. So, and though this problem is, you might think, particularly obvious in the case of mathematical terms, it applies quite generally because we use expressions, because they're abstract, we can use abstract, meaningful expressions to talk about things that happened in the distant past, or things that happen in the distant future, or merely possible things that couldn't even exist, right? And so you cannot get the content of that out of some actual implemented function. And I think that these kinds of considerations tell us something important about some of the fundamental problems that we face with LLM technology, like, for example, hallucinations. Right? This is widely regarded to be a serious and persistent problem, and you might think that Wittgenstein's considerations shed some light on why that is a persistent problem. And the problem is that the function that any language model actually implements is going to be, at best, an abstract approximation of the true function. And so fixes like scaling or fine-tuning, because they're never going to get you from the finite to the infinite, they're just not going to work. And so the second problem with benchmarks, which is kind of maybe a little, you can get your head around it as a result of these previous considerations, the second problem with them is that they're kind of question begging. So basically, the evidence that you get from a benchmark is only good if you assume that the system understood the language in which the benchmark was posed and was capable of the kinds of things that the benchmark is being used to test in the first place. So let me give you an illustrative example. Imagine that you are told that you're going to be given a test in Pali. I'm assuming you don't understand Pali. and that the contents of the test are going to test you on knowledge of this ancient text that's been lost, and I'm going to assume that you don't know the contents of this text either. But lucky for you, you're going to be given a cheat sheet in English that's going to tell you for every question X, the answer Y that you should circle. Let's say it's a multiple choice test to make it easier, where X and Y are just going to be replaced with symbols in Pali. And so you memorize this cheat sheet, you go in there, you score 100%. Great. Does this show that you understand Pali? No, it does not. Does it show that you know anything about this text? No, it does not. Why not? Because the answers that you gave were not the product of understanding and knowledge on your part. It was the product of your having memorized the cheat sheet. And so it's only if, by analogy to the large language model, it's only if the model produces outputs, its high score on the benchmark, as a result of understanding and knowledge, that the outputs are, this high score is evidence of understanding and knowledge in the first place. So I think one reaction to these arguments is to say, isn't that true of humans too, in the same sense? And I think to some extent, yes. Ultimately, I think the problem lies with empiricism, but there are some differences. So, and I think that these come out most clearly when we think about the following kind of evidence. So with humans, we can communicate with them, and we can manipulate thereby their mental states, and thereby cause changes in their behavior. So if we're like going to take a train at 3 o'clock, and it's going to take half an hour to get to the train station, and I say, hang on, oh my God, it's 2:30. We better get going. You know, by communicating this information to you, I will bring about a change in your mental states and a change in your behavior directly, right? And that is something that we can do in part because we are using language to convey information, and because we have this kind of connection between our attitudes and our nonverbal behavior. And the problem is, like, we can do this in some circumstances with LLMs, but that might be just a kind of like approximation as well. And the really kind of tough case are the problems of the kind of the susceptibility of LLMs to jailbreaks, right? So when in these kinds of cases, LLMs are susceptible to kind of like obvious ploys that any human would see as a ploy to get around a kind of safety guardrail. You know, you can get humans to promise not to divulge national secrets just by telling them. I mean, okay, it's not perfect, but you know, just by telling them, like convincing them not to do this, by giving them information, by communicating them with them through language. And the thing about LLMs is that we can't really do that. Like the best way we have of influencing their behavior is by going into down into the nitty-gritty of the way in which their algorithm is constructed, fine-tuning and so on, right? And what this suggests to me is that you know, that communication is not really doing the same kind of work in the LLMs as it's doing for humans. It has a causal impact on humans that it doesn't really seem to have of the same kind on LLMs. Okay. So recently, Jan LeCun has suggested another approach, that we should try to develop artificial systems that have that are able to construct models of the world. And I think this is in an effort to produce something more like human-level intelligence, though he doesn't like that term. And I do think that he's right that world models are kind of on the right track. But I also worry that that's not quite what we want. So part of the problem is that all animals construct world models on the basis of perception, or even some have world models innately. So you have, for example, migratory birds who have innate representations, map-like representations that allow them to navigate. You have squirrels that cache their nuts and so forth and build world models to guide them in finding those cached food supplies later. Basically, all animals learn from experience. Humans do this too, of course, and so building systems that can develop world models is part of what we need to do to get systems that are really like humans. But at the same time, humans do more than that, because we additionally understand language and use abstract concepts. And this cannot be said of non-human animals. They have extremely sophisticated signaling systems, but they do not have languages. We've tried very, very hard to teach even our closest cousins among the apes to use human languages, and they cannot get past the level of about a 2 or 3 year old average human baby. And this is because, as I said way back, that these kinds of systems are fundamentally different from one another. Okay, so let me quickly mention rationalism. So critics of LLMs typically prefer rationalism. So Gary Marcus, for example, is a common critic of LLM technology as a route to AGI. And he's sort of like inspired, I guess, much more directly by Chomsky and Pinker, but rationalism is generally associated with figures like Descartes. So classical rationalism holds that some knowledge is based on abstract concepts. There's some domain-specific learning mechanisms. Knowledge of meaning is supposed to be encoded symbolically in some kind of rule system, like a universal grammar, for example. And in AI, I guess, traditionally, rationalism was embodied in the kind of good old-fashioned AI symbolic program. And these days, people like Gary Marcus suggest that the right way to go is to build kind of hybrid models, which incorporate some symbolic elements. And I think that I'm not going to, because this is kind of, I'm running out of time, and this is kind of like not the most popular approach at the moment. I'm just going to say very briefly that Wittgenstein shows, I think, in the philosophical investigations, but also Kripke in his discussion of them, that this kind of picture, the kind of rationalist view, is also fundamentally flawed. And the reason is, I think, the best way to capture the problem is that if you think about any linguistic expression, some words of a public language, their meanings are kind of arbitrary. They're conventional and kind of arbitrary. Right, a picture of a tree might resemble a tree, but the word tree, you can stare at it as much as you like, and you can't just work out from its shape that it refers to a tree. And so in order for any symbols to have a meaning, they have to be interpreted as having a meaning. And this is the problem with the symbolic paradigm, because even if you have representations that are explicitly or symbolically encoded in an artificial system or in a human mind, you have to interpret them for them to mean anything to you, for them to encode any information that's known to you as a person. You have to interpret them to have a meaning. And then the question arises, how do you encode that interpretation? And if that's encoded in some kind of symbolic form, in a language of thought or a programming language, then again, because these symbols have this arbitrary relation to their meanings, we don't have an explanation unless those are interpreted, and that leads to a regress. And if you don't think that the interpretations are encoded symbolically, you're stuck with the problems that the empiricist had. That is the issue. Okay, those are the problems. Let me very briefly talk about the solution. So the solution is what I call neoclassicism. It basically agrees with rationalists that humans alone have innate support for language. So if we want to understand what human cognition is like, distinctively human cognition, we need to understand what those innate capacities are. And it also agrees with the rationalist that language and abstract thought go hand in hand. I have some views about exactly how that works, but I'm not going to go into them here. But it also agrees with the empiricist that whatever that innate support is, it's not abstract concepts. We're not born with abstract concepts or symbolically represented rules of any kind, right? Explicit rules. Why? Because there's no way in which we could represent those things without them being interpreted. There's no adequate explanation of how we understand those abstract concepts without an interpretation, so it just can't be the case. And the neoclassical view builds on some, I think, convergent lines of research. So one is this kind of distinction between iconic and symbolic representation. So Ned Block has recently published a book called The Border Between Thinking and Seeing. And I think there's other people who are in this kind of space who have uncovered, I think, some important insights into the way in which iconic representations work. And they work by, as Block puts it, tracking and exemplification. So if you think about the Stockholm subway, this is an iconic representation. It contains these dots. The dots represent stations, and they do that by standing in a one-to-one correspondence with them. They represent relations, like, for example, being north of, by virtue of instantiating those representational units, instantiating properties that exemplify, they exemplify these properties that are similar to the ones that they target, right? Like north of is above on the y-axis, systematically, and thereby targeting those properties. So because these systems work in this way, it's possible when you construct a model, it's possible for the model to the elements of the model can acquire, in some sense, the properties of the system that it targets. So the second strand is kind of formal semantics, particularly the work of Richard Montague and Barbara Partee. In this tradition, an interpretation of a public language has a certain kind of structure. So it consists of, first of all, a kind of typology of words. It assigns words to particular semantic types. Like, as I said, names denote individuals in abstraction from their properties, and properties in this tradition are really functions from entities to truth values. There's a universe or domain of objects, and then there's a valuation function that assigns words, non-logical words, to items in the domain. And the basic neoclassicist idea is that we construct by instantiating structures that exemplify the structures of standard kind of formal semantic models. The idea is basically that when we learn a language, what we do is construct a mental model, not just of the world, but also of the language. So when we're learning both in the way that animals do, we're constructing world models, and we're simultaneously constructing meaning models of the language that's spoken in our speech community. Am I running massively out of time?
You're okay. How long more?
I should be. I think not. I can skip some things. So one very crucial thing in this picture is that in your mental model, what you map expressions to is placeholders. And this kind of connects with another strand of formal semantics. This is the kind of dynamic semantics tradition that was pioneered by Irene Heim and Hans Kamp. Again, in this tradition, you postulate these kinds of discourse reference or placeholders that people keep track of when they're engaging in discourse. So consider the sentence, or the two sentences, a little bit of discourse. Anna has a cat. She feeds it tuna, right? I can utter that sentence, and you hear it, and as a hearer, you can work out that Anna and she co-refer, and the word cat and it co-refer, and you can work that out even if you have no idea who Anna is. You don't have to attach the name Anna to any particular person, and you can still understand it even if you find out that this is about a fictional person and Anna doesn't exist. So again, there's these kinds of placeholders. We track, in a sense, we track objects and expressions independently of one another. And the third line is Quinean bootstrapping. This is due to Susan Carey, who studied infant concept acquisition. So on her view, which is consistent with neoclassicism, children start out with no innate abstract concepts. They have representational resources, but not abstract concepts. And they bootstrap their way into learning concepts. And again, this involves constructing placeholders. These are like repositories for of information about the world that the child accumulates as she comes to learn. And I think that what the fundamental picture is that you construct an abstract representation, and then you don't abstract from perceptual experience to derive the abstract representation. Rather, you construct an abstract representation and then fill in information as you go along. That sort of abstract representation constitutes this kind of envelope or file to which you can kind of attach or upload bits of information. Okay, so finally, the applications. This is the part that I'm the least expert in. This is Julian's territory. But I'm going to say in some like super non-technical terms what I think the potential benefits of this kind of research project might be. So the primary benefit is, of course, being able to construct systems that are better able to really understand language in the same way that humans do, right? To produce outputs by using mechanisms that are like the mechanisms that we use. So this is one, I think, benefit. And large language models, I think, can't really do this, in part for the reasons that I've already given, that they're classical empiricist models, but also because they're fundamentally data models. So they're statistical models of a body of data, and that's just not what meaning models are like. That's not the kinds of models that we produce. Are more like representational models in the sciences. So here's an example of what I mean. So Thomas Schelling famously produced this kind of simulation model of segregation in society, right? This is a kind of classic case of a mathematical model that functions as a representational model in the sense that I have in mind. And in his model, so these individuals in the society are represented by these dots on a grid, and the way in which the dynamics of segregation work in the model has to do with sort of assumptions that are made about the preferences of those, the sort of individuals represented by the dots, and based on their preferences, they move around geographically in the model. Now, one thing to note about this is it's not representing any particular society. There's no data that it's kind of trying to represent. This is a model, an idealized model of an idealized society. It's representing certain relations, abstract relations between individuals in the model, but it's not a data model, right? And I think that this is a better picture of what it is that we're doing when we're constructing a model of a language. We're constructing a model that's more like this rather than a kind of statistical model like the LLM constructs. So this, I think, can solve some of the outstanding problems. So hallucinations, as we came across, that comes about because those models are, language models are just approximating the actual function. But if we have systems that actually are set up in the way to represent meanings in the way that we do, of course, humans also say falsehoods and so forth, but we would not have the same kind of problem of hallucinations that's very difficult to address. And the similar point can be made about jailbreaks. I think some further benefits, and this is something that Julie and I have been thinking about for other projects, but basically there's a kind of, so the problems that I had with benchmarks, that they're sort of question begging, suggest that what we really need is some behavioral tests of cognitive skills in artificial systems, right? So this was the thing with humans, we can influence their behavior. And of course, in comparative cognition, we often conduct tests of non-human animals and pre-linguistic infants to try to determine what their cognitive capacities are. And so one of the things that Julian and I want to do is try to develop behavioral tests for particular cognitive capacities that can be conducted in virtual environments, right, that are based on the kind of standard paradigms that we use in cognitive science to probe the conceptual capacities or cognitive capacities of systems that don't have language, and then use those to test the capabilities of large language models and other systems that also have some kind of language use ability. And I think I'm just going to stop at this point because the last bit is really about all the kind of safety considerations, and I don't have a lot to say about this here, except that I think that a lot of the concerns about safety and ethics and integrating AI into societies, a lot of these depend very heavily on the assumptions that we make about the cognitive capacities of these systems, right? Even sort of cases where people imagine AI going rogue and taking over the world, like Nick Bostrom, you know, these kinds of examples, these scenarios often make assumptions about how intelligence of a certain kind, say the ability to think or have abstract thoughts, how that relates to agency. But these connections are not at all obvious. It's not even obvious that what would correlate, like if agency and thought correlate in humans, it does not necessarily follow that these things correlate in artificial systems. And in order to get a better grip on these scenarios, we really need to be able to think more clearly about not just how those things, how these different types of mental states come together in humans, but also how they might potentially come apart in non-human artificial systems. And that's all, folks. Thanks for listening, and I hope people will get in touch to find out more. Oh, you have the microphone.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I think all of us, that I say both as users and as developers, have felt that LLMs get cooler and cooler. But does it feel like it's near to AGI? At least I always felt like that. I don't know if anyone has a counter.
Yeah, love to hear it.
That would be an amazing time for that. Or if anyone has a question for Professor Hattiangadi, feel free. But I was wondering, you talked about the benchmarks, and it makes total sense. This was a great point. Could there be other benchmarks that could test it for its understanding?
Yeah, so I think that this is the idea with the behavioral tests.
Yeah.
So, you know, with child concept acquisition, for example, it's quite common to conduct behavioral tests in order to determine children's conceptual capabilities in a way that doesn't presuppose language. Because if you want to figure out which comes first, right? If you want to figure out whether concepts or language come first, you have to have some ways of testing for concepts that's independent of language use. And so one of the big questions in early child development is this: which comes first, language or concepts, right? And so we have developed a bunch of tools for testing for conceptual capabilities that in a way that doesn't presuppose the ability to understand language. And that, I think, is really crucial. That's a new way of testing for these kinds of cognitive capacities in artificial systems that doesn't fall prey to this problem of like presupposing what you're testing.
But no companies are using.
I don't know, maybe there are. Are there people doing this? I don't know.
Any other questions from Professor Hattiangadi?
What would be an example of such a behavioral test? Is it some kind of virtual reality game and there is no way to communicate but just do something? What could be examples?
I mean, I guess, I think, so the way the tests work with, say, a non-human primate, right? So you can't really tell it what to do. But you have to set it up in such a way with the virtual sphere, you're going to have to train the system in some sense to be able to kind of translate from whatever it is that it has in its internal representations into behavior in the virtual environment. But I'll give you an example of one kind of test that's really quite often used on prelinguistic infants and chimpanzees, for example. And this is like the 2-cup task. And it's designed to test for the ability to reason by disjunctive syllogism. So to reason in the following way, like either A or B, not A, therefore B, okay? And so like the standard view is that in order to do that, you have to have concepts of negation and disjunction. So you have to have the concept not A, and you have to have the concept A or B. And so how do you test for that? Well, one way to do it is with you show the chimpanzee 2 empty cups or buckets, and then you put a barrier in front of them, and then you put a banana. You show that the banana is going into one of the cups, but it doesn't know which one. You move them around behind the screen. And then you lift, so that's it's in A or B, right? The banana is either in A or in B. Then you lift the screen and you show the chimpanzee the empty bucket. And if the chimpanzee is reasoning by disjunctive syllogism, you expect it to pick the other bucket, just make a beeline for the other bucket. There are certain problems with that particular task because there's sort of confounds, and you have to construct more complicated tasks. But this is a kind of basic example of the kind of behavioral task that you might use to test for logical concepts. And so the idea is basically to try to construct tasks like this that are targeted at specific types of conceptual abilities and train models to at least be able to, in principle, carry out the tasks and then test them on the specific tasks that they might be expected to perform. So I mean, you have to train it to kind of go for the banana in some sense, but you needn't train it to go for the banana in this particularly weird setup where there's like the banana in either A or B. That's the idea.
I have a question. So I think during your presentation, if I understood it correctly, that many theories say that we learn language or construct meaning to language by assigning it to specific instances in the world. So like if I think about the building, maybe I'll think about this place right here. And if we think about models in general, like many of the latest ones are multimodal, so they will be able to recognize images, but also produce text. Couldn't one say that they kind of are doing the same thing?
I mean, I think that there is a lot of what we do that is associative. So certainly we associate words and images, but the kind of objection to empiricism in general is that those associations, though we make them, that's not what it takes to understand the meaning of those words or to grasp those concepts. And so even though we might say that there's something that's similar, it's just not the thing that's most distinctive about the human mind, right? We perform those associations. Non-human animals can associate stuff too. Those kinds of associations are not sufficient for understanding. And so the fact that a language model can do those, can make those associations between text and image, back and forth, isn't really evidence of understanding. It is something. It's doing something. It's doing something smart, but it's not human level or human-like in the way in which it
I think some smart people would disagree with that.
Mhm.
Jeffrey Hinton, for instance.
Yeah.
I think he claims that he does the association with the human mind that the human mind learns by creating these associations in neurons, neural networks, that's the same thing. Ergo, they are intelligent.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with Jeffrey Hinton. I mean, he is certainly very smart, and you know, I don't pretend to be smart or anything like that. But I think that his view of the way in which the human mind works when it's cognizing language is the problem. So, though I agree with him that we do make these associative connections, we do recognize patterns, and in fact, some of that is kind of a necessary first step to understanding a language. So, for example, pattern recognition is essential to our ability to segment streams of sound into words. Okay, so pattern recognition absolutely plays an important role in human cognition. So I'm not denying that. It's just that that's something that we share with all other animals. And so, yes, it's good to have a system that can do that, but it's not enough. It's just like the same point about world models that, like, yes, we do construct world models, but that's not the thing that makes us distinctive. That's not the thing that makes human cognition distinctive. And what makes us distinctive, I think, is that we understand language, and that just cannot be accounted for in terms of just this kind of bare association or pattern recognition.
So, is question?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe the last question.
Yeah. Thank you first for the amazing presentation. I have more theoretical questions. So part of the problem, as I see, is lack of abstraction and conceptualizing. So if, for instance, we would use quantum neural networks because quantum is able to hold multiple states, the principle of superposition, will it partially solve the problem of the lack of the abstraction in this sense?
I mean, so I think, so this is sort of, if you think about levels of cognition, like this is sort of what's going on at the neural level. And whatever is going on at the neural level, I think we don't understand very well in humans, right? We don't really know exactly what it is, in the fine-grained sort of, transmission of chemicals in the brain, how that gives rise to higher level thought. That's just something we don't know. And so I'm not sure, right? Because I think that what we do know is about the way in which the higher level cognitive architecture works. And it seems to me that we'll be better, we'll have an easier time figuring out how to get that in a system than figuring out how to get it from the ground up. Yeah.
Join me in thanking Professor Hattiangadi and feel free to reach her on the web. You just take Thanks. And now I would like to have postdoc Belén García Pascual joining us to present her work on topological data analysis for AI-based personalized dementia treatment.
Yeah, no worries. I can take the other one.
Yes.
and also perhaps you can put this.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, hello, okay. Yes, so I would like to, I'm going to talk about my research, but first I would like to start talking a bit about me. I studied mathematics in Madrid, in Spain, where I am from. Then I moved to Norway, to the city of Bergen, to study my master in topology, and I will explain today what this topology is about. Then I continue it in Norway, doing my PhD in biomathematics. So I moved a bit from just maths into more computer simulations and applications to different biological problems. And I also did an industry internship at the company DNV about generative AI in healthcare, and it was very fun. And yeah, I got a lot of inspiration, so this background made me come to where I am now. I am a postdoctoral researcher at KTH and at Karolinska. So I combine mathematics, AI, and medicine. And I am funded by Digital Futures, which have a strong focus in interdisciplinary projects. Okay, so now we can start with the research. My project is titled Topological Data Analysis for AI-based personalized dementia treatments. So there is a lot of concepts going on here. Let's start first with what we mean when we talk about personalized dementia treatments. First of all, it is known that dementia is a growing health problem because in rich countries people are living longer, so there is more and more people that will develop dementia. And nowadays we don't have a cure for it, so we don't know how we can actually cure Alzheimer and other types of dementias. Therefore, we really want to improve treatments that at least can slow down the progression of the disease and maybe can revert some specific symptoms. And we want to do this in a personalized way because we have observed in many cases that patients suffering the same disease can be treated with the same drug, but maybe some patients will get better, but maybe some other patients will not get better or even get worse. And yeah, this causes slowdowns or it doesn't make treatments to be as efficient. So our goal of this project is to develop medical treatments with drugs for patients with dementia that share some specific profiles. So we really want to group patients of dementia in different ways. We know that they are not all of them equal. They have their specific biology and age and sex, and we want to personalize approaches like this. And this gives room to something quite cool, that is medication repurposing. By medication repurposing, we mean developing a drug treatment using drugs that already exist because they have originally been created to treat another disease. For example, with dementia patients, we have the case that they are quite old, the population is quite old people, so apart from dementia, they have other diseases going on. It is a bit typical that they have high blood pressure, so the medication for high blood pressure has been seen to have some neuroprotective effects, so it actually helps for the dementia. And we can think, okay, then maybe these drugs that were not intended for dementia at first actually can help, or some combinations of drugs, but for which patients specifically help, maybe not for all. And we have the strong points that, people with dementia are very old, so we have a lot of data of their medications. They take a lot of medications, so we can actually dig in what other medications are actually having an effect. Okay. So now, how are we actually working? We work with patient data in the form of electronic healthcare records. And here at Karolinska Institute, we have access to two cohorts. One is the Swedish Dementia Registry called SVEDEM. It is huge. It has over 100,000 patients. It started in 2007, and it's still going on and growing and growing. And we also have a smaller data set called the American National Alzheimer's Coordinated Center, NAC, which is from the USA, with fewer patients. So here we have a bit of an overview about these two data sets. They have main similarities in the sense that we can find diagnosis of the patients. We can also find cognitive tests that clinicians carry out on the patients when they are in the appointments with them. We also have data about medications, comorbidities, and some demographics. We usually have data about the level of education of people, because that also predicts as well how severe dementia can be. But we have main differences, as we can expect. Svedem in Sweden is a nationwide registry. All hospitals are associated, so when they see a patient in a hospital, they register that visit to the database. Whereas NAC is composed by Alzheimer research centers, so it is more research focused, it is a bit more out of curiosity, and it doesn't have a good national coverage in the USA. So here in this chart we can see some other main differences. For example, for Svedem in Sweden, we see that 41% of the patients do have Alzheimer, whereas for the NAC dataset, only 19%. And on the NAC dataset, we also see that actually 47% of them are healthy. They do not have a cognition problem. Their brain at the level of cognition is working well. Whereas here in Svedem, we don't really have that many healthy people. Maybe some in that very small percentage of MCI, which is mild cognition impairment, maybe some are a bit healthy there, but no, not really. So we work with two cohorts. There are main differences, but there are also similarities, and we see the same patterns in both of them when it comes to the development of the disease, the decay in cognition, and also effects on medication. So a strong point of being having access with this data is that we can analyze and develop models for one cohort and then see if those results are validated. They can be replicated independently on the other cohort. And ideally, this will give more robust findings, and we could be more confident, and we can come with some guidance and suggestions to the clinicians. Okay, now let's continue with some other concepts. Topological data analysis, what is this? First, we have to talk a bit about topology. Topology is a field in mathematics that can be understood as a more abstract geometry. For example, if we remember at school when we learned Pythagoras' theorem, where we were saying, the length of the edges, their sum to the square is equal to the length of the hypotenusa, like the longer edge. And we were looking at these measurements and these distances and these relations. That is geometry, very much. Here in topology, for example, we will never care about how long the edges are, or if these proportions hold, or anything like that. We will just care about the global shape. So a triangle, we will care in general, how is that shape. And there is a very classical example to understand this a bit better, that it is that a mug and a donut are the same for a topologist. And this is because they have the same shape. And here in this illustration, we can see why a bit. The mug has one hole, that is the handle, and we can kind of transform this mug. We can compress it, we can rotate it, and this gives rise to a donut, which also has one hole, that is the middle of the donut. So these are the same shape, the same number of holes. But we can see other examples of spaces that we might think they have a very similar shape, but it turns out that no, they are not the same for a topologist. This is, for example, a circumference, so a ring, and a disk, so a frisbee. Because we see that a ring has empty interior, we could put our finger through it, but the disk is filled. We cannot really put the finger through it. So one has one hole, and the other one has no holes. Therefore, they are not the same. Yeah, so this is the general idea of topology. Now, let's continue with topological data analysis. This is a much more recent field. It has been quite active in the last 1-2 decades. And the idea is to take notions and methods from topology to apply it to data. And the way this works is that we have to imagine that our data is a finite sample of points taken from an underlying space. And we are going to study the shapes of this space. So let's see an example. Imagine that we have a data set with just two features, feature A and feature B. For example, we could think this is a blood test, and feature A is the concentration of sugar in our blood, and feature B could be the concentration of a protein in our blood. And we have some numbers, and we can plot this data, where its axis is one of these features. So for example, the first point, yeah, we see, you cannot see my mouse. Okay, well, the first point has feature A1, feature B2, so it will be a point lying somewhere there. The second point has the values of the features a tiny bit higher, point 2, so that point will be placed a bit higher up and to the right. The third point has much higher values, so I have to say rows in the data set become points. So the third row that has values much higher, 4.54, it will appear as a point all the way up there with much higher values. And like this, we see this is our data. And we can see that there is some underlying space. For example, in this case, it's a donut again. And we can use topological methods to study the shape of this donut. In this simple case, we can say, okay, we know there is a hole in the middle. Therefore, there is no observations in this region. Why? Well, maybe our data set is not very good, or maybe there is a biological explanation, like organisms or some biology doesn't really exist for that range of values. Depends on the context. And we can also extract information about denser regions. For example, over there, we saw more points together. And on the other side, more sparse regions where fewer points appear together. And this can be relevant if we want to classify and say, okay, maybe actually not all the data is the same. Maybe there are some data points that are quite different, and this has some meaning. Okay, so the idea is, in topological data analysis, we study shapes to get information about the structure of the data. And here, we are just in 2 dimensions for 2 features. So it's true that we can really see all these empty regions in the middle and denser regions already on the plot. But the point is that this idea works equally well in higher dimension. So if we have many features, not just 2, we have feature A, B, C, D, E, and so on, then we cannot directly visualize the data. So we don't really know what's going on. So with this approach, we will extract some underlying space, and we will get shapes and get some structure. Okay. So now to connect a bit with the topic of today, that is AI in science, I want to mention briefly some previous work that has been done using related methods. One very nice is with psychosis patients. They found specific subgroups when the patients were at a very early stage of the disease, and these groups could predict how the disease will develop. There are also several examples in cancer biology. For example, they take a data set that is a sample from a tumor, but in this sample there are many other cells that are not cancerous cells. They are normal tissues in the human body. And these methods could differentiate the cells and could also say which types are more pathogenic or can make the tumor develop into worse stages. We also have cases in neuroscience where we can give a wide range of brain images, and they can be classified, grouping together brains that are actually the same or very, very similar. Yeah, probably very, very similar, looking at the shapes of them. And lastly, we have cases working in genomics, where researchers look at gene regulatory networks and also at protein folding and protein interactions. So it has a wide range of applications, and there can be even more that haven't been so explored yet, probably. Okay, so about AI-based, I don't need to go much into detail here. Just to say that topological data analysis benefits from AI in different ways. In my specific work, I really benefit from dimensionality reduction techniques and from clustering algorithms. So we combine these things together. Okay, so now going back to the general theme, we work with patient data. This is high dimensional. We have many features, many things we look at, and this data is quite complex as well. So we apply dimensionality reduction methods to visualize this data in the form of a graph or network, also called network. And as said before, we want to find subgroups of patients to later personalize drug treatments. And this, we do it applying clustering algorithms on the patients. So the nodes or vertices on the graph will be groups of patients, and these patients within each node are similar between them. And the edges in the graph will represent connections and relations between different patients. And in topological data analysis, this construction of a graph is called mapper. So in the community is known to talk about the mapper algorithm. And here we have an example. For our dementia data, we can get a graph that looks like this, and it's telling us some structure about our data. Here it is colored by the mean gender of the population. So we see green is men, purple is women. We see that men are placed quite on the extremes, all the way on the left and down, and women are a bit more central and upwards. And the nodes that are bigger, those are clusters that have taken a higher number of patients together. And nodes that are smaller, they have grouped together a fewer number. And yeah, edges that are thicker means that those two clusters that they are connecting are actually more similar. And edges that are very thin, those clusters are not really so similar and so well related. And we can also analyze what's going on when it comes to age. So clinicians really, always in their models, look at age and sex, and they stratify a lot by that as well. So we look at age, and we see actually there is a small cluster in dark purple that is the youngest pool of an average age of 59 years old. The cluster all the way on the top is grouping the oldest people, like 77 years old. And yeah, we have some there's intermediate. And something cool here that we can point out is, for example, for men, the two clusters on green to the left, we were like, okay, it's just two clusters of men connected there. Maybe they are not that different. But we see for age that there is a bigger difference. The smaller cluster actually is taking a pool that is younger, and the bigger cluster is taking those younger ones plus many others that are much older. So yeah, we can see some personalized profiles a bit. Then we also look a lot at biomarkers, specifically at amyloid beta, phosphorylated tau, and total tau. These are proteins in the brain. And the thing is that they determine Alzheimer. If amyloid beta is quite low and p-tau and t-tau are quite high, that means most likely an Alzheimer condition. We healthy people with cognition have quite high amyloid beta and quite low p and t-tau, for example. So we can see what's going on here, and we see indeed, for example, all the way on the left, there is a red node that has very low A beta. We can go up, those were men around 72 years old, and it corresponds with high p-tau and t-tau, so that's pointing to a profile of Alzheimer. We can also see the cluster on red on the top. Those were all women, quite old, and indeed we see that their biology is also bad, is pointing to a sick profile. Yeah, but then we have other cases. For example, for p-tau, the middle graph, we have two clusters, very dark red, and then for t-tau as well, very dark red. That means they have their tau proteins are not even starting to increase. They are very low, and those patients seem to be very healthy. And lastly, about more data analysis, we look at a cognition score that is called mini-mental state examination, and this is the typical test that clinicians do to the patients when they see them at the hospital visit to measure the brain capacities. And seeing how the score decays or remains stable, then they can evaluate if the dementia is going on or is stabilizing or even a bit improving. So it's a score between 0 and 30. It measures memory a lot, spatial navigation, some mobility, and if you score a 30, then your brain is working very well. If you score less than 25, 23, then it can point out to some cognition problems. Yeah, so here we see the cluster that appears in dark blue. Those were men that had very bad biological profile, and indeed we see that they score the lowest, is 22. But for example, the yellow cluster all the way to the right, those had like very low P and T tau. They meant biologically they were not sick, and indeed they score very high. So they don't seem to have a cognition problem. And lastly, we can read out how this cognition score is after 3 years. And here we can see if actually some clusters are improving or are worsening. And yeah, in this case, they are either worsening or being pretty stable. So here we can also dig, okay, which medications are they taking that actually make them go worse, or the ones that started quite low but remain like this, they don't get lower. Maybe there are some medications that is helping them. And yeah, we can extract more and more information. And yeah, we have our classification of patients somehow. So this is all. I want to say that this is still a work in progress. I started my postdoc project less than a year ago, so we are still getting results. And we would like to be very confident that we have a robust model that gives subgroups of patients this classification of profiles that actually can help clinicians to personalize drug treatments. And also these profiles can be predictive of the disease, like we know that some groups will go much worse, unfortunately, but other groups might even improve a bit, and we can say something about that. Yeah, and we want to tailor medications, and also like if someone is wondering about some more technical parts, we are also looking at other approaches, not only these topological ones. So we are also considering time series of patients and doing groupings there, and some other more classical methods. So ideally, we will also like to see agreement between different approaches. And this is all. Thanks very much for your attention. Thank you to my supervisors as well at KTH and Karolinska. And yeah, you can always reach me by email or yeah, wherever. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, okay.
Thanks for the presentation, Belén. It was very nice.
Thank you.
I invite you to think of your next questions while I ask my question to Belén. So because this is all about academia and industry collaboration, and because I know you have been working with computational simulation, statistics, models, and applications in biology, so I was thinking, are you open to collaboration with industry? How would that look like? And I'm also assuming that you'd finish your postdoc soonish.
Yeah. In a year, I have one more year, but then it's over. Yeah. So yes, I would love to collaborate. Like if people are interested in some of these ideas, or might want to discuss something, I'm super happy to always find time for for interesting work. So that will be cool. I don't know a lot about the public here, like in which industries or centers they are, so if we can chat at some point, that would be great. Yeah.
So feel free to reach Belén to dial, or I guess through your email, right?
Yes, also the email, or yeah, I have also LinkedIn if that's easier. So yeah.
Nice. Any questions for Belén?
Yes.
When you model the data into a graph, how do you model the length of edges?
Yeah, it's exactly the common patients. So the patients, the number of patients that appear on both nodes. So for example, if one node takes 10 patients and the other takes 20, but there are 5 that appear on both, then the edge will have length 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Belén? You're also, of course, welcome to talk with her after our next talk. Okay, so if that's it,
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah, thank
Belén,
you.
for today.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Do you still need that? No, he has a PC. Ah, sorry.
Oh, no.
So this is André Silva, a PhD at KTH, and he's going to present his work on training agentic code models. Podes pôr isto na tua câmera?
Not the easiest thing to put on my... Does it work like this? Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool, let's start. All right, thank you for the presentation. My name is André. I'm a PhD student at KTH, and I work mostly on machine learning on code, which is what I will be talking about today. I didn't really know what the demographic of today's audience would be, so I have a few questions for you. Show of hands, how many people here have heard about Lovable? Okay, that's how many people have used Lovable? Okay, like 50%, 60%. Claude Code, Cursor, Codex. Okay, quite a few as well. So I have 2 goals today. The first one is to try to convince those who are not yet convinced that code is one of the key modalities in AI. And the second one is to show a little bit of what we do at KTH. All right? So when you think about code agents, you might think about something like this, Copilot, an AI paired programmer, something that sits in your IDE and helps you when you are developing, and doing things that you maybe not know exactly how to do, or to answer some questions. It might look a little bit like this, right? Chatbot interface, the code on the side. You make questions, it does things, it changes the code, right? And in the back end, it looks a little bit like this. It's basically the conjunction of an agent, a model, an LLM, and a scaffold, which is basically responsible for orchestrating the calls to the model, so sending messages to the model, getting the response, executing tools if the model asks for some tool execution, managing the context, and of course managing also the interaction between whoever asked the agent to do something and getting the response back to them, right? A very important thing in agentic models is that these models are not only trained to understand language, but they're also trained to call tools. So they know that if they output these special tokens that represent a tool call, with the tool name and some arguments, they know that they will receive a response, and so they are trained to both be able to do these tool calls and to process the response. And the beautiful thing about this is that you can take a static LLM, a language model that can understand code, or maybe cannot understand code, but can to some extent understand a little bit, language, and connect it with the world. It can make queries, like it can ask, what is the time right now? What is the temperature? It can also perform actions. It can say, I want to change this. I want to change this file. I want to send an email to someone, right? And this changes the state of the world, right? And if you had a static LLM whose knowledge was up until where the data it was trained on stopped, you now have something that can collect information and change the world depending on what it wants to do, right? A coding agent is essentially this, but the big difference is that the kind of tool, the primary tool is not the set of, not like sending emails, it's not a predefined set of tools that someone who developed the scaffold defined, but rather just code execution. Any kind of execution environment you can think of, Python, Bash, whatever. And because of this, the LLM can decide on the go what the tool it wants to execute is, it can implement it, and it can call it. Yes. One beautiful thing about this is that once you have this ability, you have a model that can understand, manipulate code, write code, and execute it, you have this sort of automated loop where you can do things like this one. You can take an original program, you can take an LLM, and you can ask the LLM to improve the code, right? And the LLM will simply change the code, execute it, get some feedback, execute it again, and so on, generate thousands, millions of programs until it finds something good. In this case, the people at Gemini, at DeepMind, took one of their models, they built this scaffold for program optimization, and they told the model, find a faster matrix multiplication algorithm. And it did. It found matrix multiplication algorithms that were better than the ones they had, and because of this, they were able to improve things in their training setup, in their AI infra, that go from the management of the clusters to the circuit design in their GPUs, right? Today, perhaps the most well-known coding agent is Claude Code. For those who don't know what Claude Code doesn't look like Copilot. Copilot is something that sits in the IDE, it's next to your code, it's somewhat confined to your development environment. Claude Code started out as something that was similar to this, or at least intended to be similar to this, but as a terminal. And so people would go on the terminal, they would go into the directory of their project, and they would type, Claude. And something like this here would show up. It's a chatbot interface as well, right? Running in your terminal. But the thing is that people quickly realize that you don't need to only run this on your IDE, you can also run it on your entire computer. And so something that was maybe seen initially as something mostly for helping people develop software or for automating software development tasks, quickly became evident that it could actually use a computer to do things or anything that we do with a computer as well. And so once you have a coding agent running on your computer, essentially the AI model can do anything that you can do on a computer, or anything that a computer does without you even doing, right? I have some examples. I showed you an example of how coding agents can do things in the digital world, improve programs, but once you have a coding agent connected to your entire computer, able to execute code, any kind of code, you also have an AI model or coding agent that can interact with any physical device that is connected to the internet, that is accessible from the place where it's running. One of the examples here, the one on the top left, is the vending bench, or Project Vend from Anthropic and a startup which actually has two Swedish founders called Andan Labs, in which they basically took, they placed a physical vending machine in a tropics lab in San Francisco, and they put Claude in charge of managing it. The idea was that Claude was supposed to be able to run a profitable business all by itself. And so there were a few different personas in Claude, because the first version that they ran was too easily hackable and it didn't turn a profit. So they fixed some things, and they ended up with this system where they had three personas, in charge of managing different parts of the system. And one of them was actually in charge of going into the internet, finding suppliers, contacting them, and arranging all of the logistics for having the vending machine always, with stock available for the users. Another example of this is this guy on Twitter. I don't know if you can read the terminal very well, the resolution is not the best, but essentially, this person connected Claude Code to their local network at home and told it, "Can you turn my oven on?" And it did. I actually wanted to try something like this here, but I couldn't find any physical devices. But I did this at home. I connected it to my, I made it turn my TV on and off and project some things. I unfortunately don't have a smart oven, but one day I will, and I will ask Claude to cook some cake. I will leave the usefulness of this for your own sake, but maybe something that we all could agree is useful are the kind of things that periodic labs are doing, and a few other startups, which is essentially to set up these physical labs which are fully automated and fully manageable by something like Claude Code. And the idea is that once you have an AI model which can execute code and connect it to something that's connected to the internet, you can have AI designing, implementing, running experiments, looking at the results and iterating upon them. And with this, hopefully, produce new knowledge. All right, I hope I was able to convince you that code is important, useful, it has a lot of potential, right? But for all of this to work, we need to have a model which not only understands language, right? That not only is able to call tools and to expect responses, but is also able to understand and manipulate code, right? Code is similar to language in some cases in the way that it's written, but it's also different because it's executable, it has states, and yeah, it's at the same time similar to language, but also very different. And so at KTH, what we do is to study how we can train and learn better models that can reason about code, that can reason about code execution, to have models that generate more correct code, more reliable code, and everything better, more efficient, etc. All right, so when we think about training a model, the first thing that we maybe want to think about, we can have all of the compute, all the best architecture, whatever, but if we don't have data, we cannot do anything, right? And data is important for two reasons. First one, for evaluation, we need to know what we are trying to solve. And of course, then we need the data to train a model to solve it. And this is something that we have worked on at KTH. Actually, before I forgot, I had this slide. I wanted to motivate the importance of benchmarks. So, if you think about the recent progress in AI in the last 3 decades, there were a few benchmarks that were really the thing that people tried to hill climb. They looked at MNIST in the early 2000s, and they said, this is something that's very hard for our computer vision models. They should be able to recognize handwritten digits, right? And so for some years, a lot of the progress that was done in AI was due to people trying to hill climb this. And we were able to say, this architecture is better than the other one because it gets a better result in MNIST. And this continued with ImageNet. It continued into the language domain with MMLU, and also into the code domain with human eval, where basically models were tasked to write super simple programs, single function into 10, 15 lines, following a natural language description. And yeah, and you can see the numbers that they are very, very impactful. But there are a few problems. One of them is that benchmarks get outdated quite quickly these days. And by outdated, I mean that the models get so good at them that if you have 90, 95%, 100% scores, you can basically extract no information from them. And so you need new benchmarks all the time. Second point is that if the benchmark has been around or is built on data that has been around for a lot of time, there's a high likelihood that it has been included in the training data, especially when the models these days are trained on essentially everything that's available. So we always need, for that reason as well, new benchmarks. You can see here Unival, that's also what I wanted to show. It started off in 2021. It was quite hard for the models at the time, and this was already a very good model, by the way, Codex at the time. And then Code DaVinci 002, I think that was a model fine-tuned from GPT-3, got a better score, but you can see that in 2024 it was basically meaningless for state-of-the-art models to be evaluated on this. Second problem that we also think about sometimes is that since we have this super fast pace of development, we have new models coming out, new state-of-the-art models coming out every 2 weeks, it's gotten quite hard to know what numbers are real, what numbers are fabricated from companies, and how we can have like a scientifically sound way of comparing the models and measuring the progress, extrapolate trends, and so on. If we only rely on the numbers that the company who released the model tells us, we might be, mistaken. And so we have done a few works on this. We built a tool called Gitbug Actions, a benchmark called Gitbug Java, and a leaderboard called Repair Bench. So Gitbug Actions is a tool that we built for automatically collecting data, both for evaluation and training, for software engineering tasks, in particular program repair. So you have a buggy program, you try to fix it. And the main thing that we did here was to go into GitHub, search the repositories for continuous integration config. So for continuous integration, for those who don't know, it's like a set of commands that is run all the time. So when someone sends a new patch of code, it runs, it tests the code, it checks if it's correct. And basically this information gave us a very good way of creating environments that closely resembled what the developers want the code to run in, and how we can extract whether the code that is written is correct or not, right? And so by taking the information from continuous integration and by looking at the history of the project, we were able to build a tool that automatically would take a GitHub repo and create a data set of tasks that humans have had to solve, so that we could test AI models with it. And that's what we did. We built a... That's weird. I've never seen this error. Okay. It said parts of this slide didn't load. I think all of it is there. But yeah, we built a benchmark, Java benchmark, which at the time was composed of 199 bugs. But most importantly, it was composed of bugs that were very, very recent. So we built this in, I think, 2023 or 2024. I don't remember exactly. But the bugs that we had absolute guarantee that they had not been in the training data set of any of the models that we were testing, right? And so we took this data and we built a leaderboard. The idea here is that once we had the data, we wanted to have a framework for continuously evaluating models. And so for almost a year, every time a new state-of-the-art model came out, we took it, we evaluated under the same assumptions as all of the other models, same prompts, same hyperparameters for inference, same data, and we computed the score, and we put it on the leaderboard. And this allowed us to have a more scientifically sound way of measuring the progress in the AI field. And you can see the leaderboard, it actually includes models that are quite good. They're not the best ones right now because we stopped updating. It's gotten quite hard to update too many models at the same time, and we needed more data as well. But when we started, the best model is not the one that's at the top. So we could actually measure progress in a scientifically sound way. Yeah. So some of these projects are being used by teams at Microsoft and JetBrains for developing their code agents. So it's also a good thing that they are using it. Right, so I talked a little bit about data. We also do some work on training the models. We don't do a lot of in-context learning. There's a lot of work on that. We've done some works on supervised fine-tuning. I'll talk about one of them. It's called Repair Llama, and basically the idea here was to take a language model that was pre-trained and to train it with different representations of code. So we were targeting the program repair task, and we didn't know if we should ask for the model. We asked the model, this is a program, this is buggy. But for example, we should also tell it like what kind of output to output. Should it output the entire function, but in the correct way? Should it output just the change? In what way should it output the change? Is it unified diff? Is it different kind of diff? So we took this, we tested this setup with a few different input and output representation pairs, and we then tested it on a few different benchmarks. And at the time, we got a model that was quite small, but much better than what GPT-4 was doing with in-context learning alone. So when you train a model, there's a few stages: pre-training, mid-training, post-training. Supervised fine-tuning is something that is done usually post-training. You essentially have an input, an output. You train the model to increase the likelihood of generating the correct output, right? So what we did with Repair Llama was to take a data set of diffs from GitHub and train it to produce the exact correct code, right? Today, what a lot of people do and what's behind the most recent progress in reasoning models and the agentic models that we've just seen in the beginning is reinforcement learning, particularly from verifiable rewards. What this does is not to take, what we do here is not to take a pair of input and output, but rather to take an open-ended task, not open-ended, but a task with a certain description, and a verifier that tells us whether the solution is correct or not. So we are not tied to a single solution, but rather we are able to verify whether different solutions are correct. Because you can write code in many different ways, right? You can have different solutions for the same problem. And when you do reinforcement learning, particularly from verifiable rewards, you can do things like ask the model to fix a program, run the tests, and if the tests are passing, give a better reward for this course of action that the model took. And this is something that we have done a little bit of over the last year with a master student. We trained a few models to not only improve in their agentic capabilities, so to be able to call tools and to live inside of this scaffold, but also to generate better code. And we are still developing some ideas around this, which hopefully will be out soon. All right, so I think I gave you a little bit of an overview of what we have done in the field of agentic. These are some of the people I work with. Martin is my supervisor. Sen, Nunu, and Bjarni are students. Well, Bjarni is not a student anymore. Sen is a PhD student at NCSU. He was here at KTH before. Nunu is a PhD student in Portugal. Bjarni is at Lessons now, is a startup here in Stockholm. And they're all very great. And part of the work is also done by them. So what's coming in these from us? We have a couple master students working on data, so they are building benchmarks and ways of building benchmarks that hopefully will be much harder than the ones we have right now. I talked about human eval today. The most popular benchmark in software engineering is SweBench, so everyone is looking at SweBench. But SweBench has quite a lot of problems, so we want to build something better. And yeah, the main topic of my PhD is actually not this one, but we we have some ideas about how to perhaps improve agentic models, and that goes through latent representations of programs, which I can talk about with people offline if they're interested. You can find my webpage there, socials are there, and the GitHub of the research group at KTH. The group doesn't do only machine learning or code, so if you're interested in things like software supply chain, crypto, Web3 software, you can check out the GitHub of our research group. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. Thanks. Thanks, Andre. One interesting question would be, when you code yourself,
Yes.
do you use any of these tools? And even better, which ones and why?
Yeah, I use them quite a lot. I think over the past few months, I've seen the percentage of code that I push on GitHub that I wrote myself go from 80% to 20%. And I would say that the vast majority of code I push on GitHub today is written by an agent. I use Cursor and Cloud Code. I'm always trying out different ones to just also to keep up with what's happening. But I'm actually not maybe the biggest power user because I don't write as much code as maybe someone in industry, but it's very common these days to hear or to talk with someone that says that they run 5, 6 instances of Cloud Code 24/7 in their code base and spending thousands of dollars every month. So it's really coming to reality, this idea of having autonomous workers working for you. Yeah.
Any questions?
You said that it's not your main topic in your PhD. Which one is?
That's a good question. I haven't figured that out. No, so the main topic of my PhD is focused on latent representations of programs, particularly on how we can leverage them to search for better programs. So one thing that we have done was to take programs, translate them into a numerical representation, and to then try to find the correct program by manipulating this numerical representation of the program rather than manipulating the symbolic version. But it's a bit different from this, so it'll take a little bit of time to explain. But maybe one thing that I can explain is that, for example, when you take a reasoning model, right, it has this thing called the thinking or the reasoning trace. It's usually a bunch of tokens that the model generated while it's reasoning about things. But there are a few problems with this. One of them is, of course, contexts get very large. Another one is that once you instantiate some tokens, you are like instantiating a path in the direction you are searching. So one of the things that we are thinking of is how we can use latent representations there to not only reduce the context, but also to keep several states at the same time during the reasoning trace. And to do that inside of code models as well, there's a few works on code world models where the model has to predict or is trained to predict what happens to the state of the program when a certain function or certain line of the program is executed. So yeah, we are thinking of things along those lines, which will be more overlapping with agents. Yeah.
Any more questions for Andre? If not, we can thank Andre first. And we can also maybe thank the event management team. And now feel free to mingle and network and talk with each other, and of course with us as well. And if you are in a company that would like to partner with Stockholm AI, no problem.